Selina Caldwell had spent a lifetime proving herself. Born in a modest neighborhood to parents who worked tirelessly to provide for her, she had absorbed the lessons of perseverance, resilience, and quiet strength from an early age. Nothing had been handed to her, and she had never asked for favors. Every dollar in her multi-million-dollar empire was earned, every business decision carefully calculated, and every victory was hers alone. Now, as the founder and CEO of one of the most prestigious airline companies in the world, Selina had built a legacy that stretched far beyond boardrooms and stock markets. She had crafted an identity of silent power, the kind that didn't need validation from others. She moved through the world with an air of quiet authority, the kind that turned heads without demanding attention, the kind that made people feel her presence before she even spoke. But there was something about that very silence, that effortless confidence, that unsettled people. It made them question how a woman, especially one like her, could sit so comfortably in spaces where entitlement, wealth, and privilege were often draped in arrogance. Unlike those who flaunted their success with designer logos and loud conversations about their latest acquisitions, Selina had no need to announce herself. She was refined, elegant, and composed, and that, perhaps more than anything, made people uncomfortable. On this particular flight, the air was thick with exclusivity. The plush leather seats, gold-trimmed interiors, and hushed conversations between power brokers exuded a sense of belonging to an elite world, one where appearances often mattered more than substance. Selina walked into that world with the ease of someone who had earned her place, not through inheritance, not through connections, but through relentless ambition and the kind of strategic brilliance that made empires rise. Dressed in a perfectly tailored midnight blue blazer and slacks that hugged her frame with precision, she was the embodiment of understated luxury. Her dark, smooth skin glowed under the cabin lights, her features calm, her posture impeccable. She didn't need to assert her importance with loud declarations. She carried it in the way she walked, the way she sat, the way she simply was. Yet, despite her quiet power, there was always someone who mistook her humility for weakness. Someone who, unable to comprehend strength without arrogance, would assume she was out of place. That was the problem with people who had never needed to fight for their place at the table. They assumed those who didn't wave their wealth like a flag must have snuck in through the back door. And that was exactly the kind of assumption that simmered in the air as she took her seat. Selina had been in this position before. She had seen the lingering glances, the subtle hesitations, the quick flickers of doubt that passed across faces when she occupied spaces that were traditionally reserved for men in tailored suits with last names steeped in legacy. She had spent years navigating rooms where people had underestimated her, where they had tried to diminish her with condescending smiles and patronizing tones, only to realize too late that she was not someone to be dismissed. As she leaned back into her seat, eyes scanning the cabin with an effortless poise, she knew what was coming. She could feel it, the scrutiny, the skepticism, the quiet questioning of whether she belonged. But she didn't flinch. She didn't adjust her posture or shrink herself to make others feel more comfortable. Selina Caldwell had built an empire without seeking permission, and she certainly wasn't going to start now. Margot Sinclair had always prided herself on knowing exactly who belonged and who didn't. It wasn't just about the airline rules, the meticulous order of first-class etiquette, or the weight of maintaining the exclusivity that this luxury jet represented. It was about an unspoken hierarchy, one she had carefully observed and upheld for years. She had learned early in her career that wealth had a look, a presence, a way of presenting itself that was unmistakable. It wasn't just the polished shoes, the tailored suits, or the designer luggage. It was in the aura, the entitlement, the effortless expectation of service. Those who truly belonged in this space never hesitated, never second-guessed their importance, never held themselves with the kind of restrained grace that suggested they were used to working for their power rather than simply inheriting it. Margot was meticulous. She noticed everything, and she judged accordingly. The passengers who exuded old money, their quiet indulgence, their soft-spoken superiority, were given the warmest smiles, the most effortless service, the nouveau riche. Those who were loud and flashy, displaying their wealth in garish accessories and excessive demands, were tolerated but never truly respected. And then there were those who tried to blend in, those who sat in seats that didn't quite seem to fit them. Those who carried themselves with an unfamiliar sort of confidence. The kind that was too quiet, too self-assured, too independent, like the woman in seat 3A. Margot had spotted her the moment she boarded. The first sign was her luggage, expensive but discreet. Practical rather than ostentatious. The second was the way she carried herself. Walking with a sense of purpose but without the usual self-importance that came from being accustomed to first-class travel. Her tailored navy blazer fit perfectly. Her heels clicked softly against the plush carpet. And her expression was unreadable. And that unsettled Margot. She was used to people announcing their worth. It was easier that way. Wealth, in her experience, was rarely quiet. But this woman? She didn't look uncertain. But she didn't look entitled either. She simply was. Margot didn't like it. And so, she watched. She observed. And she decided. The woman in seat 3A wasn't like the others. She didn't fit into Margot's mental checklist of those who belonged in the exclusive luxury of this flight. And for that reason, Margot convinced herself of something dangerous. She convinced herself that this woman, Selena Caldwell, must have ended up in first class by mistake. Perhaps she had used points to upgrade. Or maybe she was here as an assistant to one of the real VIPs. Or worse, she was one of those people who thought she was important but wasn't. Margot had seen it before. People who believed that just because they had some money, they deserved to sit among the elite. But exclusivity wasn't just about money. It was about power. It was about knowing you belonged. Margot approached her seat with a kind of rehearsed politeness. The kind that carried an edge of authority just sharp enough to remind people of their place. Her uniform was crisp, her smile poised, her voice smooth as silk. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her tone measured, just shy of condescending. "I believe you might be in the wrong seat." Selena looked up. Her eyes were calm, steady. Margot expected hesitation, confusion, perhaps even a quiet apology as the woman fumbled for her boarding pass. Realizing her mistake, that was how these things usually played out. Instead, Selena simply met Margot's gaze with quiet confidence. "I'm in the right seat," she said. Margot stiffened. There was no arrogance in the woman's voice. But there was also no uncertainty. It was a statement of fact. Unshaken. Absolute. Still, Margot refused to believe it. "Perhaps you didn't realize," she continued, her polite mask still in place, though her grip on the back of the seat had tightened ever so slightly. "But this section is reserved for our most distinguished guests." A pause. Selena simply tilted her head slightly. Her expression unreadable. "I am aware." The words landed heavier than they should have. As if challenging Margot to continue this battle she had unknowingly started. Margot's stomach clenched. She wasn't used to resistance. Especially not from people like her. Her mind raced, searching for a way to regain control. "If you don't mind, I'll need to see your boarding pass," she said, her tone sharper now. No longer just polite suggestion but firm instruction. Selena sighed softly, not in frustration, not in anger, but in a way that suggested she had seen this before. Had lived through this kind of moment too many times to be surprised by it anymore. She reached into her bag, retrieved the boarding pass, and handed it over without a word. Margot snatched it a little too quickly, scanning the details, her eyes flicking over the seat assignment. 3A, first class, VIP guest. Her throat went dry, but she wasn't ready to back down. "Who booked this for you?" she asked, the question slipping from her lips before she could stop it. The moment it left her mouth, she knew she had overstepped. Selena raised an eyebrow, and this time, there was something behind her eyes, something that made Margot's stomach twist. It wasn't anger. Not exactly. It was worse. It was disappointment. And in that moment, Margot realized her mistake, but it was too late to take it back. The silence between them stretched, thick and unyielding, pressing down on Margot with a weight she hadn't expected. She felt the whispers of the other passengers, the subtle shift in the air as people turned their heads. Sensing the tension, Selena took her time reclaiming her boarding pass, slipping it back into her bag with deliberate precision. And then, finally, she spoke. "I booked it myself." A simple response, but it carried an ocean of meaning. Margot swallowed, but her throat felt tight. She should have walked away. She should have apologized, smiled, said, "My mistake," and disappeared down the aisle, pretending this moment had never happened. But she didn't. Because Margot Sinclair was the kind of person who had built her entire understanding of the world on the belief that people belonged in neat little boxes. And Selena Caldwell had just shattered that illusion. And so, instead of retreating, Margot made a choice that would seal her fate. She doubled down. "If you insist on making this difficult," she said, her voice no longer polite, no longer masked in professional warmth, but edged with something colder, something desperate, "I will have no choice but to call security." Selena didn't move, didn't blink, didn't flinch, and that, more than anything, was what finally rattled Margot to her core. Because in that moment, she understood, Selena Caldwell wasn't someone she could intimidate. And she was about to learn, in the most unforgiving way possible, exactly who she had just picked a fight with. But by the time she realized it, it would already be too late. Selena Caldwell had always known that power was not in how loud one spoke, nor in the force one exerted over others, it was in presence. It was in knowing who you were so thoroughly that no one else could shake that truth. Yet, as she sat in seat 3A, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest, she could feel the charged atmosphere pressing in on her like a storm cloud waiting to break. Across from her stood Margot Sinclair, the flight attendant who had made it her mission to strip Selena of something she had earned, not just the seat itself, but the right to exist in it without question. Selena could sense the woman's growing frustration, the way her shoulders stiffened beneath the pressed fabric of her uniform, the way her smile had become a brittle mask barely concealing the resentment simmering beneath. It wasn't about a seat anymore. It never had been. It was about control. About a woman who had built her life around the certainty that she knew who belonged in places like this and who didn't. And Selena, despite all the wealth she had accumulated, despite the empires she had built, despite the millions of dollars her company generated monthly, had failed to fit into the mold Margot had carved in her mind. The whispers of the other passengers slithered through the cabin, some indifferent, some quietly curious, and a few, perhaps too many, amused by the unfolding spectacle. Margot's voice sliced through the thick air. "Miss Caldwell, I need you to move to the back of the plane." Selena inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest. "I'm exactly where I should be." Her voice was calm, measured, but it carried with it a quiet, unshakable finality. Margot's lips pressed into a thin line. The murmur of passengers grew louder. Some exchanged knowing glances. Others turned their attention back to their glasses of champagne, unwilling to become involved. But there was one voice, sharp and cutting, that broke through the murmurs. "She probably snuck up here for an upgrade." Selena didn't turn her head, didn't bother to acknowledge the woman's words. Margot, however, latched onto them like a lifeline. "Yes, exactly," she said, a glimmer of vindication flashing in her eyes. She turned back to Selena, her voice regaining some of its authority. "If you refuse to cooperate, I'll have no choice but to involve security." Selena tilted her head slightly, watching Margot with a gaze so steady, so unwavering, that for a moment the flight attendant's confidence faltered. "Call them," Selena said. The challenge hung in the air. Margot hadn't expected that. She had expected panic, embarrassment, compliance. Instead, she was met with defiance, not loud or aggressive, but deeply rooted in certainty. Margot clenched her jaw. "Fine," she snapped, stepping back. "You leave me no choice." She spun on her heel and stormed toward the front of the plane. Selena exhaled slowly. She didn't move, didn't adjust her posture. She had dealt with people like Margot before. She had sat in boardrooms where men had questioned her ability to lead, had attended investor meetings where her intelligence had been second-guessed, had shaken hands with people who looked her in the eye but did not see her. She had won every time. This would be no different. But what Selena didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Margot Sinclair was not the kind of woman who lost gracefully. Margot reached the cockpit door, her pulse pounding in her ears. Her entire body was thrumming with barely restrained frustration, a heat spreading beneath her skin that made her hands tremble. Selena had made a fool out of her, had dared to challenge her authority in front of the passengers she had spent years carefully curating, ensuring that only those who belonged sat in these seats. She had never been spoken to like that before, not by someone she considered less than. And the worst part? The whispers had changed. The same passengers who had been amused by the spectacle were now glancing at Margot with curiosity, noticing her desperation. Her unprofessionalism. She felt it, felt the power slipping from her grasp. And she would not allow it. Something inside her snapped. Before she could stop herself. Before she could think, she pivoted back toward the cabin. Her steps sharp and unrelenting as she closed the distance between herself and Selena. Selena saw her coming, saw the rigidness in her posture, the burning anger in her eyes. She had seen this before. And yet, what happened next still took her by surprise. Margot didn't speak, didn't announce her next move, didn't hesitate. Her palm struck Selena's cheek with a sharp, resounding crack. The slap echoed through the cabin, loud and violent, ripping the air apart like a whip. The silence that followed was absolute. The murmurs died. The clinking of glasses ceased. The breath of every passenger was caught mid-inhale. Selena's head had snapped slightly to the side from the impact. But she hadn't flinched. She sat there, still as stone. The heat of the slap burned against her skin. But it was not pain she felt. It was betrayal. Not betrayal in the personal sense. Not betrayal in the way of loved ones or friendships. But the betrayal of a world that, no matter how much she built, how much she achieved, still allowed people like Margot Sinclair to feel entitled to strip her of her dignity. To remind her that in their eyes, she was less. Margot's chest was heaving, her hands still trembling in the space between them. Her own breathing was uneven, her fingers tingling from the force of the slap. And then, she saw it. Saw the way every pair of eyes in the cabin had turned on her, not on Selena. On her. Saw the way judgment and disbelief flooded their faces. Saw the businessman who had previously kept his nose buried in his tablet shake his head in quiet disgust. Saw the socialite who had made the snide remark about Selena's presence now covering her mouth in shock. Margot had expected approval. Instead, she had isolated herself. And she knew. She had just ruined herself. Selena, with deliberate slowness, turned her head back to face Margot. There was no anger in her eyes. No rage. No tears. There was something far worse. Pity. Selena reached into her pocket. The movement was slow, controlled. She pulled out her phone, unlocked it with a single tap, and lifted it to her ear. Margot took a step back, her breath quick and shallow, her pulse hammering violently beneath her skin. Selena's voice, when she spoke, was calm, almost too calm. "Hello," she said. "This is Selena Caldwell. Yes, I'm on board, and I need you to deal with the situation immediately." Margot felt her stomach plummet. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We have an urgent matter to address." Selena lowered her phone, meeting Margot's gaze one final time. And then, without breaking eye contact, she uttered the words that would seal Margot's fate forever. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The cockpit door swung open. 2 uniformed officers stepped into the aisle. And Margot Sinclair, the woman who had built her entire sense of authority on control, on assumption, on superiority, felt all of it come crashing down around her. As the officers approached, as the murmurs of passengers returned in hushed, electrified waves, as the weight of what she had just done settled into her bones like lead, Margot did the one thing she had never done before. She took a step back. Because for the first time in her life, she was afraid. The moment the slap landed against Selena Caldwell's cheek, time seemed to shatter into a million frozen fragments. The resounding crack of Margot Sinclair's palm against her skin was like a thunderclap in a silent storm. A violent punctuation that stole the breath from every soul aboard the luxury jet. The air in the cabin grew thick, suffocating, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. No one moved, no one spoke. The privileged passengers who had once whispered assumptions about Selena, those who had questioned her presence, who had dismissed her as an uninvited guest in their elite world, now sat rigid in their seats. Their mouths slightly parted, their gazes darting between her and the woman who had struck her. A crime had been committed in plain sight. And yet, no one knew what to do. All eyes were on Selena. But she did not flinch. She did not gasp. She did not lift a hand to her cheek. She simply sat there. Her breath remained steady, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. Even the burning sting that lingered against her skin felt like nothing more than a fleeting irritation. An echo of something she had faced too many times before. She could feel the silent tension pressing down on her from all sides. The unspoken expectation that she should react, lash out, retaliate, demand retribution. But she did not give them that satisfaction. Because Selena Caldwell did not crumble. She did not shrink beneath the weight of someone else's anger. No, she absorbed it, transformed it, turned it into something powerful. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into the pocket of her tailored blazer. The passengers watched, their hearts thudding in their chests, their eyes flickering with barely contained anticipation. Margot, still frozen in place, her face flushed with the adrenaline of her mistake, let out a shaky breath. Selena's fingers curled around the smooth surface of her phone. And then, with the calm precision of a woman who controlled everything around her, she lifted it to her ear. The silence deepened. Margot's breath hitched. Selena's voice, when it came, was soft but unwavering. "Hello." She paused, letting the word hang in the air like a blade waiting to fall. "This is Selena Caldwell." Margot's knees nearly buckled. "I'm on board." Selena's dark eyes flickered up, locking onto Margot's wide, panicked stare. The kind of stare a woman wore when she realized, too late, that she had burned her own world to the ground. "And I need you to deal with the situation immediately." The weight of those words crashed over the cabin like a tidal wave. Margot's chest tightened. Deal with the situation. Not argue. Not negotiate. Not plead. Deal with it. Selena ended the call with a graceful flick of her wrist. The gesture was final. Absolute. The kind of motion that sealed fates. Margot had come into this fight thinking she was the authority, believing that the power was hers to wield. But now, the balance had shifted. Selena had not needed to raise her voice. She had not needed to resort to cruelty. She had simply done what Margot could not. She had remained in control. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in that plane. And the realization began to dawn, spreading like a ripple through the crowd of privileged onlookers. Selena Caldwell wasn't just another passenger. She wasn't some executive trying to impress clients. She wasn't an assistant to a VIP. She was the VIP. She was the owner. The very ground Margot stood on belonged to her. The company that had granted Margot her paycheck, her authority, her belief that she had the right to tell people where they belonged, that company was hers. The shift was palpable. Passengers straightened in their seats. A few looked away, ashamed of the assumptions they had made just moments before. The businessman who had frowned earlier now sat up a little straighter, his gaze filled with something dangerously close to respect. The socialite who had whispered cruel remarks now stared at Selena as if seeing her for the first time. And then, as if the world itself was answering to Selena's authority, the intercom crackled to life. A voice, calm but firm, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We have an urgent matter to address." Margot choked on a breath. Selena remained still. A beat later, the cockpit door swung open, and two uniformed officers stepped onto the plush carpet of the cabin aisle. Their movements were precise, deliberate, unstoppable. They didn't hesitate. They didn't ask questions, because the decision had already been made. Margot took an instinctive step back, but there was nowhere to go. Her hands trembled, her throat tightened. Selena exhaled softly, finally breaking her silence. Her voice was low, controlled, final. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The words landed like a crushing weight, sealing Margot's fate like the final click of a locked door. The cabin felt smaller now, as if the plane itself had folded in on the moment. Passengers were no longer mere observers, they were witnesses. And Margot? She was a lesson. The officers didn't wait for her to protest. They stepped forward with silent authority. The click of handcuffs, a sound sharper than any insult, heavier than any judgment. Margot's world had unraveled in the span of seconds, and Selena had barely lifted a finger. As the flight attendant was led away, shaking, humiliated, drowning in the weight of her own choices, the passengers finally understood. Selena Caldwell was not a woman who needed to demand respect. She simply commanded it, and in that moment, it was clear to every single soul aboard that flight, she was untouchable. A call to action. Support Selena's strength. If you believe in justice, dignity, and the power of quiet strength, let this moment be a reminder that true leadership is not about force, it's about presence. Selena did not need to fight to prove her worth. She simply stood in the undeniable truth of who she was. She taught the world that control is not in raising your voice, but in never letting someone take away your value. Comment below. What would you have done in Selena's place? Like this post if you support strong women standing against discrimination. Share this story to inspire others to hold their heads high in the face of injustice. Because in the end, power isn't about privilege, it's about knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone take that away. The hush that settled over the luxury jet was thick with uncertainty. It was the kind of silence that came after the unthinkable. A stillness that stretched, strained, and waited for something to break it. Something that would shatter the fragile illusion that everything could go back to normal. But nothing would ever be the same again. Selena Caldwell sat unmoved, her presence heavier than the slap that had rung through the cabin only moments before. Her dark eyes were steady, emotionless but not empty. No, there was something in them, a quiet storm. A depth so vast that anyone who dared look too long would drown in the realization of what they had just witnessed. Margot Sinclair, once the self-assured flight attendant who had carried herself like a queen patrolling her kingdom, now stood frozen, her face drained of color. The weight of her mistake clung to her like a second skin. Suffocating, inescapable. Then came the sound that sealed her fate. Click. The intercom came to life. A single breath. A single moment where the cabin seemed to tremble with the energy of what was about to be revealed. Then the pilot's voice filled the space. Calm but absolute. His words slicing through the air with precision. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We have an urgent matter to address. Margot's breath hitched. Selena remained still. All around them, the passengers shifted in their seats, their curiosity giving way to a tension that settled like static in the air. Their expressions ranged from discomfort to intrigue, but none dared speak. Not now. Not when they were about to witness history. Margot's hands clenched into fists, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. This isn't happening. This isn't happening. But then, the pilot spoke again, and this time, the words landed like a thunderclap, shaking the very foundation of the reality Margot had built for herself. The woman you have just seen mistreated, Selena Caldwell, is not just a passenger on this flight. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere in the cabin. A woman's manicured fingers clutched her pearls. The businessman, who had previously only observed from the safety of his newspaper, slowly lowered it, his brow furrowed as his brain scrambled to process what had just been said. Margot took a step back, but there was nowhere to run. The words kept coming, each one driving the nail deeper into the coffin of her career. Her dignity, her power. She is the owner of this airline. A gasp rippled through the passengers like a wave crashing against the shore. The energy in the room changed instantly. The whispers that had once carried casual judgment now transformed into frantic murmurs of disbelief. Selena Caldwell? The woman they had dismissed, questioned, watched with vague disinterest? She was the owner of this very plane. The company. The very experience they had paid thousands of dollars to be a part of? And Margot, who had humiliated her, belittled her, slapped her, had done so in front of the very person who controlled everything. Margot felt her knees weaken, her stomach twist into knots so tight she thought she might collapse. No, this couldn't be happening. Her lips parted, but the words wouldn't come. Selena finally moved. She tilted her head just slightly, her gaze meeting Margot's with something almost unreadable. Almost, because buried beneath the calm, beneath the quiet strength, was something more. Disappointment. The kind that crushed more than anger ever could. Margot felt it. It was a mirror, forcing her to see herself the way everyone else now did. A villain in a story she had written with her own arrogance. The passengers, those who had, mere minutes ago, entertained the idea that Selena had no place here, began to shift uncomfortably. Guilt settled into the seats beside them, wrapping around their limbs like chains. They had watched, said nothing, done nothing. They had allowed it. And now, the truth was glaring at them. Unrelenting. Margot trembled. I didn't know, she whispered, though the words felt meaningless. Empty. Pathetic. Selena's gaze didn't waver. But you assumed. The words were soft, almost gentle, but they carried the force of a wrecking ball. Margot staggered back, a tear slipping down her cheek. Unnoticed. The passengers were watching. Not Selena. Not the officers who had stepped forward, waiting for the moment to escort Margot away. They were watching her. Watching the way her own actions had led her to this moment. Watching the way she had built herself up on the backs of judgment and entitlement. Only to crumble beneath the weight of her own prejudice. The businessman who had previously ignored the confrontation now nodded once. Approvingly. Toward Selena. The socialite who had smirked at the idea of Selena sneaking into first class now avoided her gaze entirely. Shame evident in the way she curled into herself. Selena had done nothing but exist in her own space. And they had all doubted her. Now, as the truth stood before them, as real and unshakable as the woman who had refused to bow, they had no choice but to confront their own biases. Selena exhaled slowly, standing to her full height. She smoothed out an invisible wrinkle in her blazer. The gesture so composed, so effortless. It sent another shockwave of realization through the cabin. She had never been shaken. She had always known who she was. Margot had simply miscalculated. Selena stepped forward, just enough to lean in close. Just enough for only Margot to hear the final words she would ever speak to her. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Margot's breath hitched. And then, just as quickly as the moment had arrived, it was over. The officers took hold of Margot's arms, guiding her toward the back of the plane as the passengers watched. Stunned into silence. She didn't fight. She didn't argue. She just walked. Because what fight was left when you had already lost everything? Selena watched her go, then turned back to her seat. As she settled back into the luxury she had earned, she lifted her gaze once more, locking eyes with the passengers who had doubted her. A silent reminder. A warning. A lesson. And as the final whispers of disbelief settled into acceptance, one truth remained. Selena Caldwell had never needed their approval. She had simply allowed them to see her power. And they would never, ever forget it. Call to action. Encourage Selena's strength. Comment below. What would you have done if you were in Selena's position? Would you have kept your calm? Or reacted differently? Like this post if you believe in the power of quiet strength. Share this story to remind the world that true power is knowing who you are, without needing permission. Because in the end, respect is not given by privilege, it is claimed by those who refuse to let it be taken. Margot Sinclair had once believed she was untouchable. She had walked through the world with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences. Someone who had always been protected by the rules she so conveniently bent in her favor. Her uniform had been her armor. Her position of authority a shield, and her assumptions a sword she wielded against those she deemed less than. But in the moments after Selena Caldwell spoke her final words, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," Margot felt something she had never truly felt before. Fear. Not just fear of losing her job, or fear of what the passengers thought of her. No, this fear ran deeper. It was the fear of irrelevance, of becoming a stain in a world that no longer had room for people like her. The officers at her side did not grip her tightly. They didn't need to. She wasn't resisting. She had nothing left to fight for. Her breath came in shallow gasps as they guided her down the aisle. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of her own arrogance was pulling her into the ground. The passengers didn't speak, but they watched. Their silence was worse than if they had cursed her. Worse than if they had screamed in outrage. They were witnessing her fall. And they would remember it forever. As she passed row after row of disapproving stares, she saw the shift in their faces. Some of these people had smiled at her when she had first greeted them at the beginning of the flight. They had nodded politely when she had served their champagne. Now, they looked away. Not out of pity. Out of disgust. Margot wanted to speak. Wanted to say something. Anything to justify herself. But what words could erase what had just happened? What apology could take back the slap that had echoed like thunder in the cabin? None. As she reached the back of the plane, she saw her fellow flight attendants standing there. Their expressions tight. Their postures stiff. They wouldn't meet her gaze. Margot had spent years commanding their respect, building a reputation as someone who upheld the prestige of their airline. But now, she was just a liability. A stain that needed to be scrubbed out before it tarnished the company's name. And then, the plane landed. Margot had always loved the moment of landing. The smooth descent. The feeling of control as she prepared the passengers for their arrival. But this landing was different. This landing felt like the end of her world. The seatbelt sign dinged, and the cabin came alive with movement. Passengers reached for their belongings. stretching after the long flight. But their conversations, their energy had changed. They were still talking about her. Selena, seated in 3A, didn't even look in her direction. And somehow, that was the worst part. To be erased. To be nothing. Margot barely had time to process the thought before she heard it, the heavy thud of boots stepping onto the plane. Her stomach dropped. She knew who was coming. 2 uniformed police officers strode down the aisle with the same precision and quiet authority that Selena had commanded so effortlessly. Margot's throat went dry. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. One of the officers stopped in front of her. His expression unreadable. "Margot Sinclair?" She swallowed hard, her entire body trembling. "You are under arrest for assault." The words sliced through her like a blade. Her vision blurred. The breath in her chest tightened to the point of pain. Somewhere, in the depths of her mind, she wanted to argue. She wanted to say that this was a misunderstanding. That she had lost her temper. That she had never meant to. But no one was listening. No one cared. Her wrists were pulled behind her, and the cold steel of the handcuffs locked into place with an unforgiving click. A sound that, only hours ago, would have signified control in her world. Now, it was the sound of her end. Passengers watched as she was escorted off the plane. Some had their phones out, recording, capturing every second of her downfall. She wanted to scream at them to stop. She wanted to disappear, but she couldn't. She was a spectacle now. By the time her feet touched the tarmac, she was nothing more than a headline waiting to happen. And happen. It did. The viral fallout. By the time Margot reached the police station, her face was already all over the internet. The video of her slapping Selena Caldwell had spread like wildfire. News stations picked it up. Social media exploded. Hashtag Margot Sinclair, hashtag airline scandal, hashtag justice for Selena. The hashtags trended worldwide. The footage wasn't just damning, it was undeniable. The angle was perfect. The sound of the slap crystal clear. The way Selena had not flinched. The way she had simply watched. The way she had let Margot destroy herself. It was the kind of story people wouldn't forget. The comments poured in. "I hope she never works again. This is what happens when you let your prejudice control you. Selena Caldwell is a queen. That flight attendant got exactly what she deserved." Margot's name was ruined. Her employer wasted no time issuing a public statement. Effective immediately. "Margot Sinclair is no longer employed with our airline. We do not condone discrimination in any form and remain committed to ensuring all passengers are treated with respect and dignity." Her career, gone. Her reputation, destroyed. No airline would hire her. No company would want her. Every interview she applied for. Every position she tried to seek. She knew what would happen. The moment they typed her name into Google, the video would appear. The moment they saw it, they would close the door on her. And she would never, ever get that door back open. The aftermath. Alone with the consequences. Days passed. Then weeks. And the world moved on. But Margot couldn't. She sat in her tiny apartment, staring at the screen of her laptop, scrolling through the endless reminders of her downfall. She had tried deleting her social media. It didn't matter. She had tried going outside in disguise. It didn't matter. People knew her face. People recognized her. And they judged her. She had judged Selena Caldwell without knowing her. Now, the world was doing the same to her. For the first time in her life, Margot understood what it felt like to be seen as less than. She had thought Selena didn't belong in first class. Now, she didn't belong anywhere. And the worst part? Selena had never raised her voice. She had never sought revenge. She had simply let the truth do the work. And Margot had done the rest to herself. As she scrolled through the news articles that still mentioned her name, her hands shook. She had wanted to feel important. And now, she was infamous. The fall had been fast. The damage? Permanent. Selena Caldwell sat at the head of the long glass conference table. The city skyline stretching wide behind her like a kingdom she had built with her own hands. The weight of the past few weeks rested on her shoulders. But she bore it without faltering. The world had changed since that fateful flight. Not just for Margot Sinclair. Not just for the airline. But for everyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or judged before they could even prove themselves. The viral video had done more than expose one flight attendant's prejudice. It had started a movement. People from all walks of life had flooded social media, sharing their own experiences, Stories of being disrespected, ignored, or outright discriminated against in spaces they had every right to occupy. Airlines, businesses, and corporations worldwide were being called out. Their outdated policies dragged into the light. And at the center of it all was Selena. She hadn't asked to be a symbol. She had simply stood her ground. But now, she was leading the change. Selena's fingers drummed lightly on the table as she surveyed the executives seated before her, men and women in pressed suits. Powerful figures in the airline industry who, just a month ago, would have never expected to be sitting in this room, waiting for a woman like her to speak. They were here because she had demanded it. She had made one thing clear in the wake of the incident. Her airline would not operate under the same old rules. Not anymore. She took a slow breath before finally speaking, her voice carrying the same quiet strength that had silenced Margot Sinclair that day. "We are no longer just an airline," she said, her eyes scanning the room, ensuring they heard her, truly heard her. "We are an example, a standard." She let the words settle. Let the weight of them sink into the bones of every person seated at the table. "The world is watching us," she continued, her voice calm but unyielding. "And I intend to show them that we are not just talking about change, we are making it happen." A few of the executives nodded, but some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Selena didn't care. She didn't need their approval. She needed their compliance. "This is what's happening effective immediately," she continued. "First, mandatory bias and inclusion training for every single employee. Not just the flight attendants. Not just the customer service representatives. Everyone, from the executives to the janitors to the pilots. If you work under this brand, you will understand what it means to treat every passenger, and every employee, with equal respect." She heard the shuffling, the murmurs of agreement, but she didn't stop. "This isn't a one-time seminar," she added, her gaze sharp. "This will be an ongoing initiative. Every 6 months. If you don't pass the training, you don't work here. Period." A few gasps rippled through the room, but no one dared challenge her. Selena continued. "Second, zero tolerance for discrimination. If any employee is caught treating a passenger unfairly due to bias, whether it's race, gender, socioeconomic status, or anything else, they will be terminated. No warnings, no second chances." At that, one of the senior executives, an older man with salt and pepper hair, finally spoke. "Ms. Caldwell," he started, his voice measured, careful, "while I absolutely support this mission, don't you think immediate termination is severe?" Selena didn't blink. "Severe?" she repeated, her tone even. He hesitated. "I just mean, sometimes situations are nuanced. Sometimes people don't realize they're acting on unconscious bias. Shouldn't we allow for education before punishment?" Selena leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. "When Margot Sinclair slapped me," she said, her voice never rising, "do you think she realized what she was doing? Do you think she took a moment to wonder if her actions were rooted in unconscious bias? Do you think she stopped to educate herself before she hit me?" The room fell into absolute silence. Selena's gaze remained locked onto the man, unblinking. "No," she answered for him. She didn't, because she didn't think she had to. The executive swallowed hard. Selena sat back. "We are past the point of gentle corrections. This company will lead by action. Not apologies. Not PR statements. Action. If anyone believes they can mistreat people because they think they are superior, they do not belong here. It's that simple." No one argued after that. She continued. "Third, anonymous reporting. Any employee or passenger who experiences or witnesses discrimination will have a direct channel to report it without fear of retaliation. Every case will be investigated. Every violation will be addressed." A woman at the far end of the table, one of the newer executives, cleared her throat. "Ms. Caldwell," she said carefully, "I think these policies are groundbreaking. But I have to ask, do you think these changes will affect business? We cater to an elite clientele. Some may not like these new rules." Selena turned to her. And then, she smiled. "If someone dislikes the fact that we demand respect for every human being who boards our planes, then they don't need to fly with us," she said simply. Another silence. But this one was different. This time, it was respectful. Because every single person in that room knew that she wasn't backing down. Selena Caldwell was a force. And whether they were ready or not, she was changing the industry forever. The public response. A revolution in the skies. The moment the policies were announced, the internet erupted. People weren't just applauding Selina. They were demanding that other airlines follow her lead. Selina Caldwell just set a new standard for the airline industry. This is what leadership looks like. Her airline is the only one I'll be flying with from now on. No more excuses. If they can do this, so can every other major airline. No more discrimination in first class, in economy, anywhere. The world was watching. And for the first time in history, an airline wasn't just a business, it was a symbol of justice, dignity, and real change. Selina sat back in her office that night, staring out at the city lights. She had never set out to be a public figure. She had never planned to lead a movement. But she had always known one thing. Power wasn't about privilege. It was about what you did with it. And she had chosen to use hers to make sure no one else would have to sit in her seat and be told they didn't belong. Not on her watch. Not in her skies. Not ever again. A call to action. Join the movement. Comment below. Do you think Selina's airline policies should become the industry standard? What would you like to see change in the way passengers are treated? Like this post if you believe real leadership is about taking action, not just making statements. Share this story to remind businesses everywhere that respect, diversity, and equality should never be optional. Because in the end, justice is not just about holding people accountable. It's about creating a future where injustice never happens in the first place. Selina Caldwell's story did not end the moment she walked off that plane. Nor did it conclude when her airline's groundbreaking policies made headlines across the world. No, this was only the beginning. What had started as a confrontation between two women, one wielding assumed power and another standing in quiet defiance, had ignited a global conversation. It wasn't just about airlines anymore. It wasn't just about one slap. It was about who gets to belong. It was about who we choose to respect. It was about who we assume is worthy of dignity. The video of the incident had been watched millions of times. It had been debated on news panels, dissected in blog posts, and shared endlessly on social media. People saw themselves in Selina, those who had ever been questioned, who had ever been told they were in the wrong place, who had ever been judged before they even opened their mouths. She became a symbol, not because she had fought back with anger, not because she had humiliated the person who had wronged her, but because she had done the opposite. She had remained calm. She had let the truth do the work. And in doing so, she had shown the world that real power did not come from raising your voice. It came from knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone take that away from you. The ripples of change, a new era of respect. In the months that followed, businesses, corporations, and entire industries took notice. Other airlines began implementing new anti-discrimination policies. Workplace training programs shifted focus to unconscious bias and customer treatment. Luxury brands started re-evaluating the way they treated all customers, not just the ones who looked the part. Margot Sinclair's name became a cautionary tale in employee ethics training across companies worldwide. The movement grew beyond just the airline industry. It expanded into restaurants, hotels, and exclusive clubs. It became about who was given the benefit of the doubt, and who wasn't. People started speaking up when they saw unfair treatment. And companies started listening. Because now, there was proof. Proof that how you treat people matters. Proof that one moment of bias could cost you everything. Proof that dignity and respect were no longer optional. And Selina? She had done what so many before her had struggled to do. She had made them listen. Where is Margot Sinclair now? The cost of a single choice. Not everyone benefited from Selina's rise. Because where Selina Caldwell became a symbol of strength, Margot Sinclair became a lesson in consequences. No airline would hire her. No business wanted her name attached to their brand. She was toxic. And no amount of regret could undo what had been done. She had tried to apologize. She had posted a long, carefully worded statement online. I deeply regret my actions that day. I let my emotions cloud my judgment. And I hurt someone in a way that was unacceptable. I take full responsibility. And I am committed to learning from this experience and becoming a better person. But the internet? It did not forget. The world had moved on from her. Just as she had once dismissed Selina on that plane. And the irony was not lost on anyone. Margot had tried to decide who belonged and who didn't. And now? She was the one left without a place. It was a fall she never could have imagined. But it was one she had created with her own hands. The final lesson. What this story teaches us all. This story was never just about one woman's fight for respect. It was never just about an airline or a viral moment caught on camera. It was about every single person who has ever been underestimated. It was about every single time someone was judged for their skin color, their gender, their background, or their quiet confidence. It was about power. Real power. The kind that does not need to shout. The kind that sits still in the storm and lets the truth rise. So what can we learn from Selena Caldwell? We learn that dignity is not something you need to prove, it is something you claim. We learn that respect is not given to those who demand it, it is given to those who deserve it. We learn that when someone tells you that you don't belong, the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to move. But we also learn something else. We learn what happens when assumptions replace fairness. We learn what happens when someone's bias costs them everything. We learn that one choice, one moment, one failure to respect another human being, can destroy a lifetime of work. Margot Sinclair never thought twice before striking Selena. But the world? It would remember her mistake forever. And that is the difference between the powerful and the powerless. Not wealth, not status, not privilege, but respect. And that cannot be taken. It must be earned. A call to action. Your voice matters. Comment below. What would you have done if you were Selena? Would you have reacted the same way? Like this post if you believe in standing strong against prejudice and injustice. Share this story to remind others that true power lies in how you treat people. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of resilience, justice, and the fight for dignity. Because in the end, respect isn't about privilege, it's about what you do with your voice.